sustainable landscape practices, and conservation biological control. Frederique was the founding director of the Professional Certificate Program in Sustainable Landscaping at Sonoma State University, and she founded and operated one of the first certified organic nurseries in California. She has extensive experience in wilderness, garden, and classroom settings, and we're very pleased to be extending her teaching experience to the web today through this webinar. Okay, so I'm going to pass the presentation over to Frederique.
Hi everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar. I'm really excited to be talking to an audience that isn't a complete beginner audience. So you're going to be hearing a few things that I haven't covered before in my introductory talks. And I always like to, this is where I work, by the way, we call it the iconic meadow. And I always like to start out by saying that as an educator who's interested in plants and insects, I love to work with just the interconnections that we find in all of nature.
Frederique, we can't see your screen yet. I just want to make sure you've clicked accept.
Yes. I thought we were seeing it. Okay, there we go.
There it is. Thanks.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. And now you can look at the beautiful iconic meadow for a moment. This is in Santa Barbara, where it seems like it's spring all the time. So here's an outline of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to talk about conservation biological control, what it is, why it matters, why it works. Just a couple basic bug facts, a little bit about plants, and then we're going to pause for some questions. And I'm going to delve a little deeper into how it works and some design parameters and resources. And we'll end with questions. My email will be in the resources on this PowerPoint. And you're welcome to email me with questions. So what it is. So here's a chart that I adapted from UC Davis Integrated Pest Management. And as you probably know, the IPM is a decision support system. It's helping us figure out what we should be doing. And it goes from the from the lowest intervention to the highest intervention. And something a lot of people don't know about IPM is you actually can use conventional pesticides if it comes down to it. So in biological control, we're suppressing arthropod populations with their native or introduced natural enemies. And that usually makes us think, okay, so now we're into environmentally sound practices. And let's take a look at what these three kinds of biological control are. So this is classical biological control. This is a case where we are importing and we're establishing an exotic natural enemy of an exotic species. And the thing that I always like to use is this case of C.B. Riley. He was the, C.B. Riley was the chief of entomology in the 1890s when the orange orchards in California were invaded by the cottony cushion scale, see in this picture, with the little beetles that look like lady beetles. And his thought was, where did this come from? And when he discovered it had come from Australia, he went to Australia and he found both the Vidalia beetle and a little fly, and he brought them back basically in his pocket. You could do things like that then. And the Vidalia beetle and that little fly saved the citrus industry in California. And everybody thought, this is terrific. Biological control works. But we discovered later it's only effective in certain situations. Really works better in perennial systems. It can provide long-term control, but it has become a very expensive option to use for most of us. And so if you have a heritage oak, say, then possibly this is a good option for you. The reason it's expensive is there's something called host switching where, and this did not happen with the Vidalia beetle. C.B. Riley got lucky. The Vidalia beetle really wants to eat cottony cushion scale. That's it. But there are cases where something can switch to another thing that you'd rather not have it eat. That means that we do extensive testing now. And so this is a very expensive thing to do, generally, and usually not suited for landscape applications. Then we have augmentative biological control. In this case, we are supplying natural enemies to control a pest. And that pest could be exotic, or it could be a native natural enemy. And we're not expecting a permanent control with this. It's temporary, and there's two kinds. And one of them, inoculation, we're releasing something at the beginning of the season, and what we're expecting is that that insect is going to lay eggs. So say you're releasing a batch of parasitic wasps, and it is their offspring that is going to give you the control. The other method is inundation, where we are releasing large numbers of insects and hoping for an immediate reduction of pests. And that's the case with lady beetles, which you may have heard don't really work well. And the first article I did for Garden Allies explains why they don't work well. And that really is a sort of a pesticide approach. You're using insects as a pesticide in this case. So now we come to conservation biological control, which you're preserving and you're enhancing your existing natural enemies. Some of those are exotic rather than native because they're well established now. Certain parasitic wasps and some flies are in that category. And so we're modifying the environment or our practices so that we can enhance those natural enemies, and we're using two major strategies to do that. We're reducing pesticides so that we can allow these natural enemies to establish, and we're providing resources like food and shelter so that they can increase their populations. And we're focusing on the strength within the ecosystem then to manage these pest populations. It isn't perfect. It requires some time. It requires patience, especially if you're switching from a conventional landscape to something that is more sustainable. You have to accept a few holes here and there, and it does require a little knowledge of ecology and just the basics of how insects function. One of the little tips I like to give people is, listen, if you've only seen one or two of something, it's probably not a problem for you. And by the way, on the lower left there, that's a lady beetle. Many different species, and they don't all eat aphids. Some eat scale and mealybugs, etc. So when I'm comparing conventional integrated pest management to CBC, as I'm going to call it now, a little shorthand, IPM is really a therapeutic approach. We're monitoring pests, and we have thresholds that we use. Those thresholds in the case of agriculture are economic. In the case of landscapes, they are more aesthetic. And you may be using conventional chemicals to control pests at some point. CBC is the only pest management I know of that actually creates a positive feedback loop. The less you use pesticides, the more your natural enemies populations will establish. The more natural enemies you have, the fewer pests, and the less you need to use chemicals, etc. So there are a lot of different garden allies. There are many different invertebrates, spiders, mites, insects, nematodes. There are fungi that are allies, bacteria, protozoa, and among the vertebrates, we have amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, including ourselves. We're garden allies, I hope. And today, though, we are going to focus really on arthropod natural enemies. And that includes spiders and mites, centipedes. And among the insects, the ones that have the greatest impact are wasps, flies, beetles, a number of different insects in the lacewing group, and true bugs. And I use the word bugs when I'm talking about insects, but there is really one kind of bug that is the true bug, and they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, like aphids and stink bugs, for instance. Okay. And so here's a couple other natural enemies. Here's a little Pacific chorus frog, and there are a lot of insect-eating birds. I'd like to just briefly mention soil organisms, because soil is the foundation for everything. And if we don't have healthy soil, we can't possibly have a healthy landscape. It always stuns me how much life there is in the soil, and the interface between the soil and the air that we live in is a really interesting place with a lot of activity. And this illustration came from a book I love, Life in the Soil, A Guide for Naturalists and Gardeners. It's a terrific book if you want to understand more about the organisms that live in the soil. So why does conservation biological control matter? So I really enjoyed this concept called One Planet Living. And this beautiful photo of our planet comes from NASA, by the way. So really what a sustainable landscape is, to me, is something that fits into this concept of one planet living, that we should not be using more resources than we have on this planet. And that means that we need purposeful landscapes, landscapes that are multifunctional, reduce our resource consumption, promote biodiversity, and that can mean different things to different people. Some people want to grow their own food, and that's an important focus for them. Others want a 100% native habitat garden. So there are different ways to go about this. I also like to touch on the fact that there are a lot of different benefits to conservation biological control besides the pest regulation on which we are going to focus today. And what we're really seeking then is this long-term sustainability of human-managed landscapes. And I'm not going to read all these slides to you. You have the PowerPoint, but there are many benefits to using conservation biological control. So why it works. The Ecological Theater and the Evolutionary Play was the title of a book written by George Evelyn Hutchinson, who was one of the founders of ecology. And I just love this title. I've never read the book, but the title really speaks to me. And so I just have a couple slides here to talk about what ecology means. Anybody who knows me well knows I love word roots. And so here's ecology, which really means the study of the household, the study of the living relations. And what that really is theory, like the theory of music. So musicology would be the study of music. And this is a blues scale here, by the way. But what we want to do is really the economy, the practice. We're managing our household, and we're applying the theory. And so we will be dipping into some of that theory in a little while. So the other big piece here, here's the evolution piece of it. Paul Ehrlich and Peter Rabin came up with our original concepts of coevolution in 1964, not all that long ago. And they actually were studying caterpillars and the plants that they eat because they're so closely allied. So much of what we do in the garden depends on coevolution. So we have specialists versus generalists. Here's a generalist. It's a praying mantid. Actually, it turns out they're a little pickier than we used to think. But we do have a lot of specialist herbivores. They eat only certain plants. We also have specialist predators and parasites and fungi. And then we have these generalists. It's usually been thought that specialists are more effective in conservation biological control. Increasingly, we're finding out that some of these generalists are really helpful and, as I said, a bit pickier than we once thought. So one of the things that makes it difficult to support what we're doing in conservation biological control is that, generally speaking, we're only measuring two-way interactions when we are studying biology. It's really difficult to measure complex interactions. If you have, in this example here, 2 plants, 6 herbivorous insects, and 6 natural enemies, look at this. You have 364 three-way interactions. That's huge. It's impossible to really analyze that. So scientifically, we have 2 ways to approach a problem like that, a complex biological system, which is what we're working in. One is this empirical approach, which is traditional manipulative experimentation, where we are testing 2-way and sometimes 3-way interactions. We also then have theory. It can't really be tested, but we can support it with the reductionist science we're doing, and we can support it with models. So the simple life of sunflower and the Gordian knot. David Andow, who is a researcher who has done a lot of work in this field, and actually is the one who came up with these numbers I showed you on the previous slide, likes to use this Gordian knot of complexity. That's a legend from Phrygian Gordium, and it was associated with Alexander the Great. It was used as a metaphor for an intractable problem. So this was an actual rope that was all knotted up, and the challenge was to get it unknotted. And how did Alexander the Great solve this? He solved it with a sword. Just gave it a bold stroke. And that is really what we do when we're looking at how we can support conservation biological control. Because we actually have ample empirical scientific evidence that underpins how effective this is in agricultural ecosystems. There's not a lot of information, by the way, not a lot of research has been done even in agricultural systems. Even less has been done in conventional systems, and that makes it really critical for us to rely on what we know of ecological theory. So we give you a couple of bugs here, and I'm going to quickly tell you this is from a book called Evolution of the Insects. It's beautifully illustrated. And without going into this in a lot of depth, you can see that arthropods are a really large part of biodiversity on this planet. This shows us how insects are distributed. And this is going to be important in a couple minutes. Holometabolists, the big green piece of the pie here, those are insects with complete metamorphosis. And we're going to look at that in a bit. You can see the ones with incomplete metamorphosis are a much smaller slice of the pie. A lot of our pests fall into that little slice of the pie, however. So I have a couple slides here I have from my days at the university, and I don't have individual photographers' names on most of these, so I apologize for that. But this is an important concept to us in pest management. Insect systematics is the way that we divide insects up. If you go look at a traditional collection, you'll see wasps and flies and beetles and butterflies. And that is a really useful thing when we're looking at evolutionary relationships between these arthropods. However, what matters more to us is ecological guilds. This is not guilds in the way that permaculture uses it, where you might have a plant that's fixing nitrogen, something that needs nitrogen. These are organisms that fill the same ecological role. So along the top row, you see there a pollinator guild. It includes, on the left-hand side, there's a fly, and then to the right of guilds, it's got a honeybee and a butterfly. Well, we can have bats in there, or lemurs. And the thing about these guilds is they're human constructs to help us understand what we're looking at. The spider is there in a generalist guild. And my very favorite guild is here at the bottom. It's the aphid-eating guild. So hummingbirds eat aphids too, by the way. They feed their babies aphids. So we could divide this up in other ways. For instance, the hoverfly that is in the pollinator guild is also down here on the right in the aphid-eating guild. So you could have carnivores, omnivores, herbivores could be your guilds. Another thing to take into consideration is how insect populations grow. pests grow very quickly. In good weather, aphids can be reproducing massively every 5 days. They don't need males to reproduce. Predators are slow, often only have one generation, and it's partly why I said we need a bit of patience when we're establishing this system. A lot of predators are more sensitive to pesticides than herbivores because basically they're meat eaters, and so they're concentrating the pesticides. So it bears repeating, patience is required. So there are different ways that insects grow. And so I'm coming back now to the complete metamorphosis and incomplete metamorphosis. And the reason this matters to us is that in incomplete metamorphosis, insects are basically eating, they're feeding in the same way. If they started out chewing on leaves, they're going to go through life chewing on leaves. If they started out chewing on insects, they're going to go through life chewing on insects, or in the case of a true bug, sucking bug juice. And some of the insects that fall into that category are some of our worst pests. So the true bugs with this piercing, sucking mouth parts, aphids and grasshoppers are in this group. They're chewers. Complete metamorphosis is what we think of when we look at butterflies. Right? We have an egg and a caterpillar and a pupal stage and an adult, and sometimes the feeding mechanisms are very different. And I'm always interested that nobody ever asks me where the caterpillar garden is. So here are all the ways that insects are feeding on plants. This is a true bug here. And where you don't see a name on the photograph, by the way, it's because they're photos I took. So this is a bit scary. I used to have a slide for every single one of these, and it just sort of freaks people out. So I've dropped that now. Predators, parasites, and parasitoids are helping us control these things. And I'm not going to read this to you, but I'm often asked what is the difference between a parasite and a parasitoid, because insects are parasitoids generally, the ones that we are interested in. So the right plants. What are the right plants? I'm going to come back to coevolution and herbivorous insects for just a moment. And the reason why native plants are so important has to do with this really tight relationship between herbivorous insects and the plants that they eat. And you will look at this oak tree here. 800 species of insects live in oak trees. Oak trees are a keystone species in much of the world. So those 800 insects are just the ones that are eating the tree, and they're eating every part of it. The roots, the bark, the cambium layer, they're boring into the heartwood, they're eating the leaves. But we don't really notice them. What we notice are the birds. And it's good to know that 95% of terrestrial birds here are feeding their babies insects. And over half the insects they're feeding them are moths and butterflies, which are closely allied to the plants they live on. They're very host specific in general. So if we don't have native plants, we have fewer of the insects the birds rely on. Bird populations, in fact, are down 60 to 90% in the last 40 years. It horrifies me to know that. So we need native plants for ecosystem health. Do you need all native plants? No. You don't. Some people will tell you you do, but in fact there are a lot of wonderful plants that can support natural enemies. It's just important to include natives. Many of these natural enemies feed on flowers in the adult stage. They need nectar for energy. They need pollen for protein. Some of those natural enemies don't attack pests at all. So hoverflies, for instance, only attack pests in their larval stage. So we have a lot of studies that show us that floral resources are really important to attract not just pollinators, but these natural enemies of herbivores. And it's important to note that the flowers that are recommended for agricultural use are not always the plants we should be using. and sometimes they're even invasive. If you're a farmer, there's nothing you love better than a study that says, hey, quit mowing down your field edge there because you've got all kinds of things that are attracting beneficial insects. That probably isn't the way most of us want to landscape, though. And I always like to point out, too, that we're so stuck on floral resources because we are rightfully concerned about pollinators, but there are a lot of other plants that are important to natural enemies and ways to design our gardens. So the carrot family is by far the most important plant family to parasitic wasps. It attracts a lot of other beneficial insect species. It doesn't attract many pests because it's got a lot of toxins in the plants. It's already present as weeds in a lot of agricultural systems. A lot of species are invasive. Okay? So what we are faced with is figuring out what plants do we use in gardens then. It is important to read those lists of recommended plants with a critical eye. Here's a beautiful member of the carrot family, and it's an Eryngium. My experience has been that there's a lot of different species here. The ones with the tiny flowers attract the tiny wasps and flies, and the ones with the bigger flowers attract others, bigger insects. So I know this looks like a thistle, but actually it's a member of the carrot family. A lot of those carrot families, though, they've got a short flowering season. And so we either choose species to bloom over a long season, or we use repeated plantings. And this is where our vegetable gardens come in handy, because things like cilantro and dill and fennel, parsley, these are all wonderful plants, maybe nothing better than parsley, to attract parasitic wasps. The daisy family is wonderful everywhere, and again, we have compound flowers. They attract even very small insects. Look closely at a yarrow or a goldenrod, and you will see that they have very tiny flowers. But in the Asteraceae, what I've noticed is it's really important to be observant about what is working in your own region. There are some sunflowers that attract virtually nothing. It's real interesting to go out and just look. And one of the things I like to do is I like to visit other gardens, and I like to go to the nursery and see what's blooming there and what's visiting. Generally speaking, if there are a lot of flower visitors on a plant, it's probably a good thing to include in your landscape. The mint family is primarily for bees, but it attracts a lot of species of beneficial flies. And here, again, flower size affects which insect species visit. And a lot of that is in effect how long their time is. Can they reach in there to get the nectar? It includes a lot of our common culinary herbs here. Rosemary, thyme, all the sages are included in this family. And then we have the cabbage family. It's often included on lists of plants that attract beneficial insects, but when you go out and observe what's going on, it's not always the case. Sweet alyssum, actually a fantastic plant for attracting all kinds of tiny predatory and parasitoid insects. Unfortunately, where I'm living right now in Southern California, it's invasive, so I don't use it here. So here's a family that is wonderful in the West. We have all kinds of plants, the ceanothus that you see here, coffeeberry, all sorts of things in the Rhamnaceae, but there aren't as many of those in other parts of the country. So the plants that are going to be effective for you are going to vary throughout the country. There's actually a wonderful paper put out on native plants that attract natural enemies in Michigan. Most of those plants don't grow here in California. So again, it's important to take the lists that you see with a grain of salt and see what is going to work for you in your particular area. The buckwheat family seems to be wonderful all over the country where you can have suitable species. That's a beautiful little fly with the cones on its legs there is a tachinid fly. Tachinid fly is very important in the garden, and they often look kind of like house flies. That one was pretty attractive, but They do often look like houseflies, but they're more bristly, and if they're visiting flowers, that's a good insect to have. Many of them attack true bugs. The rose family has a lot of great members to it, and it's important, not just with the rose family, but with others flowers, to choose things that have easy access to nectar and pollen. Finally, grasses. Grasses provide really critical early season pollen for a lot of things, and really important habitat for ground-dwelling predators like beetles and spiders. And the grass plant that is pictured here, I actually watched some lady beetles climbing out of it one day because they had overwintered at the base. And of course, that was the day I didn't have my camera with me. So we were going to pause here for questions.
Yeah, so if the audience has any questions, please type them into your question box. And one thing I forgot to mention is that Frederic did give us some handouts, and they should be available for you to download in the Handouts tab on your little GoToWebinar control panel. So that includes a lot of the resources that she's been talking about. Frederic, does the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden have a list of plants for your specific area that attract insects?
What a wonderful question. We're developing one right now, and it is a question I've been getting for years now. We can't be completely specific. Sometimes the questions are, which plant do I grow to attract an enemy that is going to attack a particular pest? And this is where California is so young. We have so much to learn still, and we are busy learning it. We have a research department here that is working on all kinds of projects having to do with native plants and which pollinators and which natural enemies they're attracting. So you should see a list coming out pretty soon.
Great, excellent. Well, I don't think there are any other questions if you want to go ahead and continue. Oh, actually, there is a question. Grass plumes. Can you touch on a few beneficials or such that are attracted by grass plumes?
Grass plumes. Well, one of my favorites is soldier beetles. Soldier beetles are one of those insects that you won't read about in agricultural literature. And that's a great question, by the way, because it brings up this good point. There are so many things that can help us in an ornamental landscape. You won't see them used in agriculture because they require an undisturbed soil and leaf litter to pupate. And yet they're a terrific insect. They eat all kinds of pests, and they like that early season pollen. Lady beetles as well, you will sometimes see on grass plumes eating the pollen. And possibly hoverflies. I haven't actually witnessed that, but it would make sense because they need pollen to lay eggs.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's all the questions for now, I think.
Okay, great. Okay, how it works. So a lot of garden features that promote conservation, biological control. I think I alluded earlier to the idea that this is actually easier to do in landscape situation than it is in agricultural situations. First of all, we have the issue of monocrops. But we also have age of gardens, and there's a lot of disturbance. A lot of agriculturists continue their tilling and turning the soil. There's a lot of disturbance. So things like the soldier beetles we were talking about have difficulty getting established. Gardens, especially as they age, are wonderful perennial systems, and they are far more complex. And we're going to touch on some of these other things in the next slides. So I'm not going to go over those things immediately. So first of all, we have structural complexity. So that can be spatial. In other words, a garden that's layered, that provides all kinds of different textures and thorns, heights of plants. And then temporal, which means providing resources throughout the seasons. Gardens change throughout the seasons, and there are all kinds of organisms that thrive in those different spaces and times. So in a landscape, we're providing a lot of wonderful little niches for organisms to survive. It's one of the things that has made insects so successful, is that a lot of them can live in a really small ecological niche, and they can fly. The identity of enemies then can differ depending on the regions, depending on the years, also depending on the season. And while we're really used to the idea of thinking of plants as being seasonal, we don't always think of insects that way, but we should, because for the most part, they are seasonal as well. So I apologize for the blurriness of this photograph. I must have uploaded the wrong one. But the important thing on this slide is richness and abundance, and what the difference is between those two things, because sometimes we talk about biodiversity without really understanding what that means. And richness, when you talk about species richness, you're talking about the total number of species that are present. Generally speaking, the more plant species you have, the more arthropod species you're going to have. But we also have to factor in abundance. How many individuals of each of those species is present? So that can be really important. You could have 99 species, but if you only have a couple of each one of say 99 species, and then you have 1 million of your last species, that's not a really sustainable ecosystem. So how those are distributed actually really matters. The other term that I think really comes into this conversation is functional biodiversity. It isn't just richness or abundance or even the interplay between those, but also what is the identity of the species that are there. And that brings me to insurance species. So if you are relying on traditional biological control where you're intending to buy your insects, this is a lady beetle pupa, by the way, you have a choice of very few coccinellid species. That's what a lady beetle belongs to. But by growing a landscape that provides resources for lady beetles, you are going to have all kinds of species you wouldn't otherwise have. And then what will happen is that, say that if fungus comes along that attacks this species, well, you'll still have 3 or 4 others that can fill that role. And these may not even be related to each other, by the way. Not necessarily a coccinellid, but you just have so many species there, your aphids have gotten out of control, something's going to be there that is going to help bring them into control. And it's fascinating to watch this in action. I have seen lupins absolutely covered with pea aphids, and come back a couple days later and seen the plants swarming with soldier beetles, and a couple days later they're gone. The aphids are simply gone. It's quite amazing. And so that leads us to resiliency. The ability for the ecosystem, or garden ecosystem, or the ecosystem at large, to reorganize itself after a disturbance. And it may not reorganize itself, it may not go back to what it was, but it will be able to go back to something that works for it. So when I'm thinking about these food web relationships, and I've seen some wonderful photos where you just think, what the heck is going on here anyway? Just another reason, as far as I'm concerned, to not be killing insects without understanding what their role is in your landscape. Because everything is food for something else, ultimately. And even your predators and your favorite parasitoids are getting eaten by yet another thing. So we have a real dependence on having both arthropod and plant diversity in these landscapes for this to work. But our landscapes don't exist in isolation, and this top photo is from a work done by some there's a whole team of people in Switzerland and Germany. In Europe, there's been a lot of work done on habitat islands and corridors. How can we connect things? And this is where hedgerows come into play. Of course, beneficial insects respond to fragmentation at different scales. Some parasitoids, very, very tiny, they actually look a bit like dust motes when you're looking at your garden, and they are pushing the boundaries of how small something can even be and have systems. Well, they can't get very far before they need to feed, and so they are sensitive to fragmentation at very small scales and actually get to a point where they're so small they get carried by the wind, and so then that complicates some of our studies. But generally speaking, I like to think about connecting gardens from the urban heart of a city to the wildland. If we could rethink our traditional shrub border as a hedgerow for habitat, and we could go a long way to increasing connectivity. And then, of course, we have edges. Gardens are full of edges, and that creates something called an ecotone, where you have more species at the interface of, say, a hedgerow and this field here than you do in either the hedgerow or the field. So it increases your total number of species generally. So if we're really seeking sustainability on this planet, we have to conserve biodiversity at this landscape scale. This is scientific landscape scale now, not landscapes that we are designing for our gardens, be they commercial or residential. So what is the right design? Oops, that just skipped. So our constructed landscapes can be easily manipulated to maximize factors that have been found to increase pest regulation by natural enemies. We can manipulate all of these things having to do with complexity through space, complexity through time, and providing the resources that are needed. So here are just a few tips about things that we should be looking for. And again, if you have questions about what some of these are, I'll be happy to answer them later. Two things I want to point out. One is shrubs on the windward side. If you are a tiny flying insect, you probably don't like wind. And that is true. Hoverflies are a really important component of a conservation biological control program, and they detest wind. So some shrubs on the windward side are good. I'm often asked, what's permanent mulch? And by permanent mulch, I just mean let your leaf litter fall. There are cases where people do want to rake up leaves, say under their roses or fruit trees, where you know you're going to have some disease problems. Another strategy you can use there is to cover that with a nice thick layer of compost, where you know that the litter could cause you issues later. There are all kinds of beneficial insects that live part of their life cycle in the leaf litter, and they don't want it disturbed. It's important to offer places for things to overwinter, and that means don't cut everything back to the ground in the fall. It's tempting to go out there and just whack everything back. I tend to do this in stages so that things can move from one area to the other, or leave some heaps of the things that I harvested in a corner, maybe near the compost heap, so that I can let things that are pupating on the branches, for instance, survive. So here are the things that we need to provide: water, food, and shelter. And so providing water for insects is very easy. Some of them don't even need supplemental water for their entire lifespan. Succulents are fantastic for this because they collect water in the little leaf cup there. A little bit of sprinkling. Bird baths are great, and so, because people often will tell me, like, I don't have room for a pond. This is a pond at Lotus Land there at the bottom. But you don't need a pond or a stream to provide the water that insects need. This is a sandstone boulder on the right, and we have several of these at the Botanic Garden. You're looking across here through the wild area of the garden. It's not our cultivated area. But we have several of these stones, and we've drilled holes in them, and there's a little dripper there. and they are a magnet for wildlife, especially with the drought we've been having. So shelter. Shelter is providing safety from predation, from harsh weather, from wind, as we discussed, and then it's also providing places where things can reproduce. And the photo on the right actually was something that somebody had installed at a garden I saw in the Berkeley Hills one time, where she loved lizards and toads, and she had toad homes and lizard houses everywhere. And you know what? Her garden was full of toads and lizards. It was pretty cool. So food. So we're providing plants for herbivorous insects because we do need the herbivorous insects to be there for our predators to have something to eat. We're providing a lot of floral resources because, as we talked about, a lot of these insects need pollen and nectar for part of their life cycle. And it's a tarantula hawk on a milkweed plant up there, 2 tarantula hawks, which prey on spiders, which are another predator we love. So things are complicated out there. So these are all milkweed, and besides the caterpillars that we love that turn into monarchs, milkweed supports an entire community of insects. And there's a little book I love called Milkweed, Monarchs, and More. It's a field guide to the invertebrate community in the milkweed patch, and it's listed in the resources. So one of the things I like to tell people about native plants, because what you hear is, oh, well, I planted rosemaries and it's attracting tons of pollinators, it's covered with bees. And yes, it is. But if you look at this milkweed umbel in the bottom right, you see a little tiny black dot, excuse me, on one of the flowers. That's a native bee. So I think it's important when choosing our plants to remember that we don't notice what's absent. We only notice what's there. And so maybe you've planted a garden full of exotic plants and you see plenty of activity, but you're still missing a lot of things that rely on native plants. So that brings us now to alternate prey. I have a lot of gardening friends that like to grow milkweed for the aphids. So aphids tend to be very host specific, other than our friend, the green peach aphid, which will eat just about anything. These are oleander aphids. And the oleander aphids, they'll attack oleander, which we don't really love here in California, and a couple other members of the dogbane family. But what I see, and we have big patches here on the grounds, is that there's a cycle that happens. And so you see the oleander aphids are infesting this plant. But down here at the base of the leaf, I see a little syrphid fly larva, and it's getting ready to attack those. And when you look closely, you will see all kinds of lacewing larvae, and predatory wasps will come in and attack these. The hummingbirds will come and harvest them. And a week or so later, all of a sudden, there's no aphid. So it cycles. And what happens with a plant like this is you just plant some off in a corner where they're not going to be too visible. And it acts like a kind of nursery to be increasing your populations of predatory and parasitic insects so that they will go and then attack the aphids on your roses, because most of these insects that are attacking the aphids are generalists. So the same thing was true, we're going to refer back to the sunflower when I was talking about the Gordian knot. I use sunflowers a lot. I work a lot with school gardens, and in the fall they've got ratty looking sunflowers, and we take the kids out with a magnifying glass and say, what do you see underneath the leaf? Well, of course, the first thing you see is aphids, but then you start seeing a lot of these same insects, the hoverflies, the lacewings, sometimes you see aphid flies, all kinds of things, lady beetles in every stage, all attacking these oleander aphids. And if you go out and spray water on these to get rid of the aphids, you are also knocking down all of your beneficial insects. Ladybug eggs look a lot like these yellow aphids. And so, for instance, at school gardens, leave a couple of those sunflowers off in a corner, or if you're going to pull them out, just put them to the side of the compost heap and let these things go through their complete cycle. Okay. So, conservation, biological control in landscapes. So we have a lot of, here at the garden, what we really have a lot of is something we call naturalistic landscape. This is actually a property off in Montecito, and it was planted entirely with natives, and this is very easy to support pollinators and beneficial insects with this kind of a garden that's all natives and left really natural looking. This is a little more formal. This was at the Botanic Garden, and actually we've just recently been working on a renovation, so it already looks different than this. And this is still a fairly naturalistic looking environment, but what we've been finding is that not everybody wants a naturalistic landscape, and we're really getting away from this idea that to have effective, sustainable landscapes, that they need to look kind of messy. Well, they really don't have to look messy, and you can use native plants in a more formal setting and even exotic plants. And this photo here, this is from Lotus Land. Some of you may have heard of Lotus Land. It's definitely on the formal landscape scale. And long ago they had an article about how they use conservation biological control, and I'm naturally a skeptic. That's probably why I'm a scientist, and I went to visit, and it turned out that, and this is Lotus Land again, it's really a magnificent garden. This is a map that their plant health manager gave me, and these little pink bars and circles are insectary gardens, and they're all sort of hidden. They're hidden along the lane and by the employee parking lot, and they have one in the middle there. The oval is open to the public so that they can talk about this. So they're very formal gardens, but they're still using conservation biological control, and they still are avoiding the use of pesticides. So resources. I feel like I've thrown a lot at you pretty quickly. I want to make sure that you know I'm quite available via email. I don't always answer right away, but I do answer. And these are some of my favorite references here. If you want something that it really digs deep into the ecology of the landscape, there is nothing better than this Principles of Ecological Landscape designed by Travis Beck. It is pretty meaty and it's pretty textbooky, but if you're interested in ecology, it is my go-to book. Bringing Nature Home, probably many of you are familiar with. What a wonderful, brave thing Doug Tallamy did by telling us we needed herbivorous insects. And he's got a newer book out now with more photos, not necessarily more useful, but a lot of great ideas in there. And he wrote that with Rick Dark. I use whatsthatbug.com a lot when I'm trying to identify insects. And the other thing I use is Facebook. I'm a big fan of Facebook identification groups. So that is a really good way to figure out what something is. There are a couple groups where you post a photo of your insect and you will get an answer pretty quickly about what it is without having to delve into dichotomous keys. Garden Insects of North America has got a lot of great photos of the insects that are pests. I use the IPM UC Davis site a lot, and also the Cornell site is another really good one. Oops. And then finally, this is our meadow again, and when it does this in the spring, it's hard for me to even sit in my office because it is just buzzing with life. So I hope I've given you a few things to think about as you're designing your landscapes. And please do email me if you have any questions after today's webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frederic. That was a wonderful presentation. And please, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them into the question box, and I will relay your question to Frederic. We have one very specific question from Diana in Southern California, and she asks whether there's a natural enemy to the Asian citrus psyllid.
You know, they're working on trying to find something for that. They don't have anything yet. And when they do have something, that is going to be classical biological control, where they have gone to Asia. They're looking at the natural enemies of the psyllid there. And you know, most of the things that cause us problems are really from elsewhere. They tend to be exotic, and they don't have their own natural enemies here. And so what happens is we're going to have a big lag time while they find that and test it and make sure that it's not going to switch hosts. But they're working on it.
Great. You see a lot recently about insect hotels, and I was wondering whether insect hotels are a good thing for beneficial insects, or whether you're really just sort of concentrating a bunch of insects that may eat each other in the same place, or what your feeling about insect hotels is.
So first of all, I'm going to tell you that there is a link to an article I wrote on insect hotels on the Garden Allies spreadsheet, and that was not one of my regular columns. I did two feature articles. One is on habitat hedgerows, and the other one was on insect hotels. I love insect hotels. There's a lot to know about. We could do a whole presentation just on that.
Right.
They're not always effective, and I mainly think that they're just fantastic to get people to sit. I usually put a little bench in front of them so you can sit and watch the comings and goings. And yes, there are things that eat each other, and a lot of what you attract actually are wasps, not just bees.
Okay.
Good wasps.
So we have a question from Margaret about how you can help to keep stink bugs out of houses in the fall. I don't know if that's a problem in California or not.
Now, you know what we get here is the Asian beetle will come in sometimes, and then I've had issues with oh, now I'm going to forget the name of it. There's a bug that I get up north, and I'm actually from Northern California. And so, and that one accumulates on the walls outside of the house, and I use my husband's shop vac, and I vacuum them up.
Yeah, I've heard people got vacs for the stink bugs too.
Yeah, that's my only real suggestion, you know, and I think a lot of times those insects are coming in as it gets cold and rainy, and I'm sorry I don't have anything more useful for you on that.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have any tips on convincing homeowners that the damage to their plants won't really be noticeable in conservation biological control?
Well, one of the things I refer them to is, you know, go take a walk in nature, and usually you're not walking around thinking, oh, look at all this awful bug damage. And the other thing is that there are some strategies. I did an article that has a little online component. It's not included in the resources, about what some of those strategies are. You know, it's like, well, don't plant milkweed near your front door. Relying on evergreen shrubs there that you know are going to look fantastic. Frankly, I've talked to some of our own gardeners who think nothing eats manzanita. The other thing I like to tell people is, you know, most insects are super good at hiding themselves. It's why you don't see the 800 insects eating the oak trees. Insects are food for everything. You know, only the sun, only plants are taking energy from the sun and turning it into food. And that food needs to be converted for most of the other animals. Everything relies on plants to survive. And the insects are doing most of that work of converting it, and so their strategy is they got to hide if they don't want to get eaten. There are way more insects out there than people realize.
Right. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for, oh, we have another question. I just have to give people enough time to type. Do you have an opinion on quarantine versus maintaining planting plants that still attract our problematic insects such as hemlock woolly adelgid?
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Quarantine.
So I think that she's asking, like hemlock trees attract hemlock woolly adelgids, and maybe the question is whether you should continue to plant hemlocks or other trees that are attacked by specific insects, even though, would you still plant them if they're continually attracting
No. I wouldn't, I love to garden, and I am a lazy gardener, and if a plant needs pampering and special attention, usually I invite it to exit my garden. I like to relax and enjoy the landscape, and so plants that are, like here, hibiscus here always has problems, and so I'm just not going to bother with it.
Yeah, I think that question she may partly be thinking about in hemlock. We're losing a lot of hemlocks from natural areas in the east, and so and same thing with ash trees with the emerald ash borer, and so since they are a native species, and we hate to lose them from the landscape, is it worth continuing to plant them? Is it still ecologically valuable to plant them?
Yeah. A bit of philosophy. I'm not sure that I would. I mean, we're having problems out west too, right? There's climate change, and we've had this drought, and all kinds of trees are being killed by beetles, and I don't know that we can effectively have an impact on the conservation of those species by planting those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think maybe in a home landscape it may not be very practical, but from in a large restoration project, you might have other there might be other approaches.
Yeah, so that's different. Restoration is a completely different topic.
Yeah,
and that's what our executive director is, restoration ecologist, actually, and so he would be a better person to address that than I.
Okay. All right. Well, I think there are no more questions, and so I just want to thank everyone very much for attending. And Frederic, I really appreciate your taking the time to do this presentation for everyone.